So, Armando, thank you so much for coming to speak to Unwell today.
Okay.
And we were talking earlier about the Iraq War and the sense of where people were at in terms of being able to speak up about this. And that seems to be reflected in your film In the Loop as well, about people being afraid to speak. Could you say something about it?
Well, I think there was an enormous amount of frustration on the part of the public. You know, in the UK, the biggest demonstration against the war was the march, where about 1.5 million people went on a march through London, very well-behaved, coordinated, all sectors of society, all fringes and centrist groups, and you know there was no sense of it being hijacked by one political organisation or another. And it was very clear there was a lot of opposition to the war. And I was struck by the comment that a government spokesman made later that evening when told that 1.5 million people had marched against the war, when he said, well, there are 60 million people in Britain, so that means that 58.5 didn't march against the war. You just think, that's not really how it works. I think each demonstrator there is representative of, you know, 100,000 more who live elsewhere and who felt they couldn't. I felt, you know, when the Queen Mother died about 4 or 5 years ago, 100,000 people queued up to pay their respects and go past her coffin. That didn't mean to say that 59,900,000 weren't interested. And I found that deeply frustrating, this level of arrogance that politicians feel that once they're in power, they can ride over public opinion. And I think in the build-up to the invasion of Iraq, we got a very clear sense that something wasn't quite right. They weren't quite telling us all the facts. As it emerged, there weren't really that many facts. There was hardly any evidence. What evidence there was exaggerated, in some cases falsified, or found off just one unreliable source. And yet, I feel that the Fourth Estate, the media, didn't do its job, wasn't forensic enough, wasn't asking the tough questions, were taking a lot of politicians at face value. And you then ended up with that strange situation not long after the invasion, when they discovered there were no weapons of mass destruction, that pathetic situation of august organs like the New York Times and the Washington Post apologising on its front pages to its readers for getting it so wrong.
And what also struck me was some of the papers actually were rather indignant that somehow the politicians should have told them the truth.
Yes.
As though they were, you know, 4-year-olds.
Yes.
And also the way they patronised the people who did get it right, the people who did march. And even long after, years later, I remember writing a furious letter once to somebody, talking about the sloganisers, the Stop the War sloganisers. Hang on a minute, we were the ones who turned out to be right. At least be a little respectful.
When I was researching the film, I met the only congresswoman in the House of Congress, the House of Representatives, to vote against the invasion of Iraq. And she was telling me, like, for 2 or 3 years, the level of abuse she was getting.
Really?
And now she's hailed as having great foresight. You know, Obama gets elected because what distinguished him from, say, Hillary Clinton was that he criticised the war.
Absolutely.
He wasn't in the Senate when the war decision was made. It would have been interesting to know how he would have voted if put to the test like that. But at least he was able to say, and it to be seen as a virtue, that he had been against the war.
And another interesting thing, I think, is that, you know, the politicians seem to think, oh, well, we made a slip up here, but it's okay, they'll forget.
Yeah.
But they haven't forgotten.
They haven't. And I think what is interesting is that the type of relationship between politicians and the media that existed in 2003 is radically different from how it is now. I think then politicians felt they could control the media. They had this, I know it happened a lot in the UK, politicians courted certain journalists and certain newspapers and certain newspaper editors and proprietors. For us.
Started Rupert Murdoch.
And agreed an exchange of information. You know, we'll tell you this if you go easy on us on that. We'll give you an exclusive on, you know, you can see the Prime Minister's wife in her dressing gown and slippers if you don't criticise us for our, trade union legislation or whatever. And there was that sort of to and fro. And certain journalists bought into it because they felt, we've got to be able to file a story in a year's time about what's going on. So I don't want to blow all my sources. So if we agree this, we'll get this in return. Yeah. Now, I think also there was an assumption from politicians that the public couldn't really do much about it. Yeah. There were only there was a finite number of newspapers, finite number of TV channels covering with news outlets, and that's it. And what's happened since then is that it's become infinite. Yeah. You can access information from anywhere in the world. Yeah. You can place any sort of information up to anyone in the world. Now, that comes with its own risks in that it's easy for a story that has absolutely no bearing on reality whatsoever to gain momentum and traction, as they call it, because it's appeared on some blog somewhere and then another blogger has picked up on it and it runs out of control. That's the downside. But the upside is, I think, that level of frustration on our part as citizens who feel we can't voice our objections or we can't find out the facts has gone. It's so much easier now to just little things. If you have the slightest suspicion that something a politician is saying doesn't quite chime with something you vaguely remember them saying a year ago.
You can look it up.
You can look it up. In the past, you had to go down to the library, you had to call up, it was a lot of hassle. If you lived away from the nearest reference library, if you didn't have access to, a journalist's phone number or a researcher or something, it was impossible. But now you can look it up. You're your own researcher. Yeah. And you have your own library. That, also the fact that you can, if you object to something and you want to voice some level of protest, you can put something up on Facebook saying, join me if you object to this. And not saying that you're going to change the world, but every now and then, one of these campaigns that seems to have emerged from nowhere gains enough momentum that it actually does make an effect. The other thing, of course, is in the past, when you were trying to launch a petition, it was the physical thing of having to be near enough people who would sign it and be physically capable of then taking it to the politician or to the centre of government or to the ministry or whoever. Now, your audience is international. Yep. They're only one click away. And I think that has given, your private citizen a level of power or potential power that they didn't have.